Hello, I'm Fran Burwell, Distinguished Fellow at the Europe Center of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Good morning to those of you in the United States, and good afternoon to our European colleagues. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to this discussion of the geopolitics of transatlantic policymaking on artificial intelligence. For the past few months, the policy community has been buzzing about AI, its opportunities, its challenges, and the many results of individual explorations of its capabilities that have shown up online, including the Pope in a designer jacket. But for a number of years now, AI and the capacity to develop it has been seen in the foreign policy world as a key element in national security, not only because of the capabilities it may bring, but also for what it says about the strength of technological innovation in any particular country. Two countries have stood out in this race for AI, the United States and China. Both have sought to lead in the development and deployment of AI, both in the commercial and military spheres. But there's another actor on the AI stage, the European Union, which is very likely to become the first major regulator of AI. Yet the EU and European companies have not yet been major developers of AI. Nevertheless, from the beginning of the Biden administration, AI has been a priority topic of consultations between the US and Europe. We have heard a lot about trustworthy and human-centric AI, and this brings up the topic of values, which in turn brings up the topic of alliances, partners, and do we deal differently with AI in a values-driven partnership than in a relationship dominated by national security considerations? In this panel, we're going to explore this triangle of the US, EU, and China, and consider whether and how cooperation on AI should lead to some form of multilateral governance. We're not going to focus so much on the technology itself, but rather its impacts and the questions it poses in the foreign policy world, especially for the transatlantic partnership and our like-minded partners. We have a wonderful panel to discuss these issues. First, Dragos Tudorache is a member of the European Parliament representing Romania. Most importantly, he has been co-rapporteur of the EU AI Act, so very much involved in the parliamentary changes in that act and the current negotiations. In fact, I think he has a trilogue later today. Karan Bhatia is the global head of government affairs and public policy for Google. He has held a number of senior US government positions, including as deputy US trade representative. Elizabeth Kelly serves as the special assistant to the President for Economic Policy at the White House National Security Council, National Economic Council, where she handles the financial regulation and technology portfolios. She previously worked on the Biden-Harris transition team and in the Obama White House, but she's also worked in the financial sector. Kenton Thibault is a resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, where she focuses on Chinese influence operations. She's also worked in the private sector on government relations for companies operating in China. I want to remind our audience, or let our audience know, that your questions are very much welcomed. Please go to askac.org. That's askac for Atlantic Council.org, and it will allow you to select for the event and to put your question into the mix. We look forward to hearing from you. So let's start with Dragos Tudorache. You have been, as co-rapporteur on the AI Act, central to getting the draft to where it is now. What are your expectations for the final shape of the act? One, about when will we see it by the end of the year? But also, one of the key principles that was initially voiced was that it should be the uses of AI rather than the system or the actual AI itself that should be determine what was high risk and how it would be regulated. But after the release of ChatGPT, you seem to have shifted a bit in discussing how to regulate foundational or generational AI. Would you explain a bit about why you made that shift, but also give us a brief overview of how you think this is going to turn out? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Fran. Thanks to the Atlantic Council. Good morning to those on the US side, and good afternoon to everyone else here on the European side. starting maybe with the simple part, which is where we are in the process and what are the expectations for calendar. You rightly said that we have later today what is the second trilogue, which is the second political negotiation between the three institutions, Council, Parliament as co-legislators, and the European Commission as initiator of the legislation. It is the first substantial discussion we have. The first one just 2 weeks ago was just the opening show. And we do expect to finish by the end of the year, which is certainly not going to be an easy process. Nothing has been easy about this text so far. I don't expect it to get easier now. But I am confident, and not only myself, my co-rapporteur as well, we are confident that we can actually wrap it up by the end of the year, because we feel the sense of urgency here. Just like you mentioned, the whole world is abuzz with AI and setting some sort of guardrails in place. And since we have the legislation on the table, we certainly want to finish it. And since we also have elections next year, we all agree that this is something that we have to get done before elections kick in and campaigns kick in. So again, there is a shared understanding and a shared commitment across the three institutions and the political establishment here in Brussels that we have to wrap this up by November, December at the latest. And there are, of course, several big debates to have still at this stage. We as Parliament have gone quite further on a number of points from the initial proposal of the Commission, not only on the list of prohibited practices, where there has been a lot of buzz about biometrics, about law enforcement access in general, and the deployment of AI in law enforcement context, but not only, and then going all the way to, of course, the flavor of the day, which is generative AI, foundational models, which was not at all in the scope of the proposal 2 years ago, but at least we in Parliament felt that this was something that we should simply, that we can simply not afford to let out of the text. And this brings me to the very concrete question you asked: why is it that we deviated somehow from the overall philosophy of the AI Act? Because indeed, for those that have been following a bit what we were doing up to now, but also for those that did not, our approach is to look at the risks of actual use cases of AI, not to regulate the technology itself. We said it from the very beginning. Not only that it would be impossible, technology constantly changes, so you can't really capture it and attach rules to it, but also because it would be wrong. Technology is neutral; it doesn't do anything per se. It is how you use it that makes it good or bad, and therefore you have to focus on those uses and focus on the risks. So that's in simple talk, that's the fundamental approach of the text. And it's true that with foundational model we have somehow changed that. But we have done that after very thoughtful consideration of the options. So first, as with everything, we looked at the option of doing nothing. And we asked ourselves the question politically, can we afford to do nothing? Like the Commission did nothing, or the Council, after actually considering it for 2 presidencies in a row, under the Slovenian presidency and the French presidency, eventually they decided to do nothing. This was before ChatGPT. I think it's an important remark to make. We in Parliament have thought, okay, can we afford not to do anything about it? And our answer to that was no. Simply because it was not only us. Many experts, many, in fact, companies themselves developing generative AI who are saying, listen, the potency of this technology is such that it can really go in directions that we as developers do not want to see it go. But in order to prevent that from happening, we need some standards, because simply relying on our good faith or moral compass to keep us from actually unleashing this technology to go in those directions is not enough. We are in a competitive market. If my fellow competitor is doing more by decreasing the ethical standard, then why would I be doing something different if I want to stay competitive? So again, we've had quite a number of developers of foundational models saying we want a race to a standard rather than a race to the bottom. So that's number one. And number two, we looked at impact. We looked at impact and we said, listen, again, it's too impactful of a technology, too versatile, too potent, again, to not try to put some at least basic rules about transparency, about accountability in the development of this technology. And we have deviated in the sense that we've said, listen, yes, okay, it is a type of AI that has some characteristics that need to be curtailed in the way they use the data sets, the amount of data that they use to be trained, the kind of content that it can generate in all directions, and on that we have imposed. I'll stop in a second, Fran. And on that we've said, okay, let's imagine some rules that are specific to these features of generative AI. Let's not label it, because this was also an option. We had many who said, listen, just label it as high risk. It's the simplest thing to do. But we did not want to do that because, again, I think it would have been wrong. There are a lot of generative AI that is not high risk in itself. So why would we unnecessarily characterize it as such? But again, we looked at what is it that, in our view at least, any developer of a generative AI would need to do. And we stopped at transparency. It stopped at some basic accountability rules that we thought are not too cumbersome, that they are also based on state of the art, and that we believe companies could live with, could also put on the table for their customers to gain trust, confidence in the use of this technology. So that's a bit where we've been and where we are right now in approaching the negotiations. And sorry for maybe taking longer than I should have.
That's okay. It's a complicated subject. Let me go over to Karan Bhatia. Karan, Google recently released Bard in Europe after a few days delay, which I understand was to deal with some privacy related issues and European privacy regulation. What is, as you move towards the public release of AI systems, what is Google's approach to regulation in Europe? How do you see the impact on you of the AI Act? And I understand that there was a meeting between Google executives and high levels at the commission. There is talk about this, the guidelines to basically bring the AI Act, or what the final result of it, not into force, but to provide guidelines for the 2 years that it will take to implement the AI Act after it's passed. Is Google looking forward to participating in that? How are you approaching regulation in Europe?
Great. Well, Fran, first of all, great to see you and everyone on the panel, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this. And it's certainly, as you say, a very topical discussion. I think we've seen globally just an explosion of interest in, particularly spurred by generative AI, into the topic of regulation. I would maybe start by, though, stepping back a little bit and pointing out that artificial intelligence isn't new. It's not new for us at Google. It's something that we've been building into our products and services for years now. Those of you who utilize, say, Google Search, and will start typing a query in and have the remainder sort of suggestions show up, what we call autocomplete. That's AI in practice, in action. Or when you are searching through Google Photos for a picture of a loved one or some particular scenery, that is AI in action. Or when you go and check your Gmail and realize that a lot of spam has been filtered out, that's also AI in action. The point being, I don't want to leave people with the sense that this is the beginning of how we or other companies operating this space have been thinking about this. We've been doing that for quite a while, but there's no question that we are at an extraordinary moment here, in part because of the amount of regulatory and policy focus that this is rightfully getting in Europe and around the world. Your question was, how are we thinking about regulation or the intersection between government and the private sector here? And I think, the way we think both sides need to think about it is 3 words, right? Bold, responsible, and together. So bold is, simply a recognition of the extraordinary opportunities that artificial intelligence is going to offer economies, governments, countries, individuals, to better themselves, to grow, I mean, we're already utilizing this tool in ways to address some really fundamental challenges, things like climate change, human health, food security, and we're just going to see those replicate and grow in number, and so I mention this because it is so important as we think about regulation, which always inevitably is going to be a balancing act, that we give ample focus and credence to the opportunities, the incredible opportunities that this technology is creating and will create. So that's the bold side. I think responsible, look, I mean, we as a company from the outset, from when the AI Act, for instance, in Europe was in its inception, have supported the existence of regulation. My boss, our CEO, Sundar Pichai, said AI is too important not to regulate and too important not to regulate well. And look, in the absence of regulation, and I think MEP Tudorache had this exactly right, it's been left to companies to figure out what those guardrails are. And so we, for instance, going back to 2018, adopted what we call our AI principles at Google. And they are effectively a governance structure that dictates what we will and will not do with AI. And as a result of the application of those principles, and literally there is almost like an internal judicial system that works where, you know, ideas are presented and council sort of thinks about, well, that could create this risk or that risk. As a result of that process, we have not rolled out technologies that could be very, helpful in some settings because we are worried about what the opportunities for mischief or nefarious uses might be. So clearly it would be better if we could agree on those guardrails. And that takes us to point number 3, together, right? That this is beyond any individual government or even small groups of governments, I think, to deal with. This is really going to have to be done by virtue of simply how broadly distributed the technology already is. You know, it is going to have to be done in a multilateral, multinational setting. And equally importantly, it is going to have to involve many stakeholders. This is not a government-only endeavor and cannot be effectively. It is going to have to involve the private sector. It is going to have to involve civil society. What we have said is that this is a 21st century technology that requires 21st century ideas of how to regulate. And so to your last question about how do we feel about things like voluntary codes of conduct, we're quite open to them. And indeed, we've been engaging in a discussion around such a code with the US government. I know, as you referenced, there's been discussions around that kind of approach being adopted in addition to the AI Act in Europe. We'd certainly be interest in participating in those discussions. But I do think that sort of multi-stakeholder process is going to be a key feature of how this effectively gets regulated going forward. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for putting all that on the table. Elizabeth Kelly, the Biden administration has put forward some executive orders and other announcements about AI, most notably the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. There's also been the NIST risk management framework, which was recently released. And there have also been some other measures that the administration has taken. What are the priorities for this administration in addressing AI, especially since to date we lack any legislation? What are the administration's thoughts about the opportunities for AI, but also the challenges that it may present?
Thanks, Fran. I'm grateful to be here today, and thank you to the Atlantic Council as well. As an administration, we firmly believe that AI is one of the most powerful tools of our time and will bring extraordinary benefits. It will help solve challenges like disease, climate change, food security, and holds the potential to improve productivity and drive growth. But as the president has said, to seize AI's opportunities, we must first mitigate its risks. We must make sure the US is a leader not only in developing this technology, but also in managing both the current and potential risks that AI poses to safety, security, human and civil rights, privacy, jobs, and democratic values. The Biden administration will continue to mitigate these risks and ensure that we have responsible innovation. As you mentioned, last October, we proposed an AI Bill of Rights, followed by NIST AI Risk Management Framework this January, to help make sure that core protections like cybersecurity, data privacy, and anti-discrimination are built into AI systems from the start. In February, President Biden issued an executive order directing federal agencies to root out bias in their design and use of AI. And just this May, the president announced new AI R&D efforts to drive breakthroughs in critical areas like climate, agriculture, energy, public health, education, and cybersecurity. Of course, we recognize there is much more to be done, and we are engaging with stakeholders across industry, academia, labor, and civil society to gather the best ideas for how we can work to support responsible innovation while managing the risks of this revolutionary technology. We wholeheartedly agree this is not a government-only endeavor. At the same time, we must ready our government for the changes that AI will bring, and we must set rules of the road that further protect Americans' rights and safety for the risk of AI systems. President Biden and Vice President Harris are committed to doing their part, including the potential of advancing new regulations and supporting new legislation, so that everyone can safely benefit from these technological innovations.
So thank you for that. We have seen actually quite a bit of cooperation between, let me just follow up with you, we've seen quite a bit of cooperation between the US and the EU. In fact, as an outsider watching, I've seen I'd say a strong convergence, at least on the rhetorical level, in terms of the documents that have come out of the US administration and how they often reflect wording that we've seen in Europe. Although not specific regulations or anything like that, but just in terms of values and ambitions. We were talking about the EU's AI Act before, and there's been a lot of discussion of AI in the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. The last TTC, there was actually mention by, not in the statement, but by Executive Vice President Vestager, of a US-EU Code of Conduct on AI. I don't know if that's a real proposal or if that was a rhetorical flourish, but how is the cooperation going? And much of the cooperation, to those of us watching, seems on a very basic level in terms of definitions, taxonomies, standards. What's the importance of that? And how do you see it moving forward?
Thanks, Fran. I think we are incredibly heartened and excited about the great collaboration that we have with the EU here. Transatlantic cooperation in the development and use of AI, both governments and private sector working together, is going to be absolutely critical to striking the right balance between AI's benefits and risks. And we have a shared desire to drive responsible, trustworthy, and ethical innovation with needed safeguards. I think we're all very encouraged by the progress that we've made together. As you note, in December, the US and EU agreed on the Trade and Technology Council joint roadmap for trustworthy AI and risk management. That roadmap focused on advancing shared terminology and taxonomies, leadership and cooperation in international technical standards development, and analysis and collection of tools for trustworthy AI and risk management, and monitoring and measuring existing and emerging AI risks. And just 2 months ago, the US and EU unveiled their first deliverables from the implementation of the joint roadmap. Specifically, we stood up a working group of experts dedicated to work such as identifying standards and effective tools for advancing trustworthy AI. And we also committed to extend our work to include foundational models, including generative AI systems, considering their emergent behaviors and risks. At the same time, we're working together to deepen our collaboration with other partners. For example, as part of the joint roadmap work, our expert working groups will be identifying and developing opportunities for the US and EU to increase contributions to global standards development writ large.
Thanks very much. I think the standards development piece actually is one of the most important going forward, or could be one of the most important going forward, but we'll come back to that. Let me bring in Kenton Thibault now. And we've talked about the EU and the United States, but China is also a huge player in the AI world and has just released its own version of rules governing the use of AI. Can you give us a short description of those rules and what you see as the impact on China's policies, both its ability to innovate in the area, but also its role in the world in terms of global AI.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share the stage with all of these, the panelists. So this latest document released last Thursday are these interim measures for the management of generative AI services. This is the next iteration and update from the previous draft of China's rules to regulate AI services, which came out largely in response to the appearance of large language model-based generative/general purpose AI services like ChatGPT. So this latest draft actually clarifies that the measures are meant to regulate only public-facing technologies, whereas previous drafts did not have that clarification. And back to the point on innovation, this seems to really be the party responding to industry and academic inputs into the process. This last draft before this one that just came out was a draft for comments. And you see a lot of the comments and the suggestions for changes actually being implemented in this interim document. So it seems the party's really responding to industry and academic inputs to really allow more breathing room for the industry to innovate. The hurdles for public-facing services are by design extremely high. Companies have to register their algorithms with the CAC, the Cyberspace Affairs Commission, and training data and model outputs are required to be true and accurate, which is a pretty impossible standard for an LLM trained on data on the web to meet. So the interim measures really follow a series of regulations from 2021, which covered recommendation algorithms, and rules from 2022 covering deepfakes. These regulations are forming a sort of body of work that will later form the regulatory basis for a national AI law, which is slated to be, it was recently announced, I think in June, and is slated to be drawn up before the end of the year and submitted for review to the National People's Congress. So that's kind of coming down the pipeline soon. And in terms of China's ability to innovate, it may be first helpful to kind of trace the origin point of these measures as largely stemming from the party's perceived need to control recommendation algorithms and control public opinion. So for example, just to kind of illustrate the interconnection between these two things. Bureaucratic ownership of these regulations have so far been under the Cyberspace Affairs Commission, which is responsible for regulating content online and what's referred to as public opinion management, are basically making sure that broader public opinion is shaped and guided in a direction that's favorable to the CCP. As an illustration of this point, the current director of the CAC also serves as the vice minister of the propaganda department. And so we see in these new comments for generative AI that the requirements apply to, public-facing services, but they're defined as services with public opinion attributes or social mobilization capacity. So China's entry into this regulatory space was first very narrowly focused on algorithms, and which is born out of this kind of classic authoritarian need for social legibility and the need to control public opinion. And in the documents for all of these regulations, you also see requirements relating to services needing to maintain the correct ideological orientation and such as well. So following this kind of narrow entry, China began to sort of widen the field away from just algorithmic recommendations and to think about how to kind of develop the industry, how to innovate. This was in response to just the natural development of the technology and also in response to growing restrictions on China's ability to import core technologies. So they passed a series of reforms which were centered around breaking bottlenecks caused by these restrictions, and also to sort of align industry, the bureaucracy, and the academia / the scientific community around this goal of really pushing innovation. And there's been a big propaganda push around this on domestic social media, with Chinese government accounts heavily amplifying and promoting narratives online, touting China's progress and prowess on AI. And equally so, however, it's heavily censoring discussions of China's reliance on US technology. For example, in March, censors on Weibo were heavily removing posts stating that China's new AI chatbot, Ernie Bot, I believe it's called, copied US technologies. And this is in a kind of an effort to downplay and control public understanding or awareness of the US-China tech gap. So in sum, this new iteration of measures show that while China is still very concerned about being pretty strict on the public-facing side of things due to the social mobilization capacity, recent moves to both develop and spur the industry and the receptivity with which China is adjusting these regulations in response to industry feedback and feedback from the science community and academia shows it's really trying to shape the system around promoting innovation.
So Kenton, let me just follow up very briefly. Is it possible to maintain this dichotomy between public facing, where there are really strict rules and everything has to be, algorithms have to follow rules and everything must be, what was the phrase you used, true and accurate, and then have another space where there can be more exploration or fewer rules in order to foster innovation? Is that dichotomy possible to maintain?
I don't know if it's possible to maintain. I think there's some analogs in the past that have shown that China's pretty good at kind of separating out its, business to business or, government to business sector from the kind of the public facing technologies. But I'd say that it's definitely designed around fostering that ecosystem that's more business to business or government to business, really pushing innovation there and really very much controlling the public access to these technologies.
Right. So let me go back to Dragos Tudorache. In the AI Act, there are some things that were banned, as you mentioned at the top. I don't know that China is actually mentioned in the act, but it's clear that there are some concerns about the way governments, particularly non-democratic governments, might use AI. And I wondered if you could say a bit about that, that ambition in putting together the AI Act. You had mentioned before that companies were concerned about an ethical race to the bottom with AI. But if you have is it possible that this competition is not between companies, but between governments? Can you still have an ethical race to the bottom? I also want to ask you a question from our audience here. Does the EU, in developing the AI regulation, have the ambition that it may have a de facto and actual extraterritorial effect? This is the GDPR question, I would phrase it that way. So if you could speak to that as well.
Well, I can't state for a fact whether the Commission, when drafting Article 5, which is the article with the prohibitions, had China in mind, but certainly some of the models that China is using to deploy artificial intelligence in the public life are certainly the examples of how you do not want, or at least how we do not want to see AI being used. Take social scoring, which is one of the applications of artificial intelligence, which is expressly prohibited by the AI Act. Well, who does social scoring and who has perfected the idea of social scoring powered by AI? Well, China has. And I will very much link it to what Kenton was saying earlier. You have a party, you have a state that is not trying to protect its citizens, but it's trying to protect itself from its citizens and from their opinions and from their possible criticism or attitudes towards what the state is doing. So I think to a large extent, this is the best examples. And in fact, I am using these examples quite a lot to illustrate why is it that it's important to prohibit some use cases of AI. And I'm using China and saying, is that the kind of society that we want to have? Is this the kind of relationship between the citizens and the state that we want to have? The same stands true for public surveillance 24/7 in the streets using AI profiling algorithm. It's the same debate about biometric use. I'm always saying we're not prohibiting biometric technology in Europe. It's a false claim to put forward. is going to be used just as it is used right now, from security all the way to using and opening our phones or passing an e-gate in the airport. That will continue to be done. What we do not want to have in Europe, again, is AI being used for public surveillance on a massive scale, which is exactly, again, what China is doing. And I can go on and on, predictive policing. And so, in fact, if we want to understand why is it that we have chosen here in Europe to say that some applications of AI are just so detrimental, in our view, to our values and to the way we understand the rights of our citizens, that we simply do not want to have them on our market. And yes, indeed, I think a good example to understand practically what that means is to look at China. Now, on the extraterritorial, I make the link to the question from the audience about our ambition. We don't have an ambition as such. And I always say that, at least I don't know how other co-legislators of mine feel, but I certainly from the very beginning, I've said that we do not want to force a Brussels effect like GDPR had. I think there is a certain inevitability to that, by the fact that we are going to be the first ones with legislation adopted, and we are also a big enough market to matter. Which means that, yes, if you want to play on the European market, you'll have to develop it according to our rules. Will that have an extraterritorial effect? Of course it will have, direct or indirect, but again, you won't be able to play in this market. You won't be able to put your services or your products on this market unless you comply with the rules. But what we have to do, and now I go to some of the to the very good triad of issues that we had earlier about being bold, being responsible, and doing it together. I think that's the essence of what we're trying to do. We don't want to count only on the forced Brussels effect. We want to develop together a set of standards, and I'm glad to say that, in fact, this afternoon in the trialogue, the first thing that I hope we're going to agree is the approach of standards. That's a very good thing. It shows that we have alignment, and I think tonight we will have confirmation of that. We have alignment between the co-legislators on the approach of standards, and that very much speaks for how we understand the need for convergence and how we want to make it practical, how we want to take it down to the earth, and to have a bottom-up approach where those developing AI, the companies that know best what AI is and what it isn't, participate in the standard making, and that is something that is aligned and is open to alignment with other like-minded partners, particularly the US. And it stands true for how we draft definitions. The definition that we have inserted in our proposal in the parliament is almost word for word the same that NIST has adopted, and so on and so forth. So again, this drive towards doing it together is something that we have put at the heart of our work in Parliament so far, and it will remain until the very end of the process.
So let me go now to Karan Bhatia. Karan, as a major corporate player in this world, this is clearly a very, very complex environment, both within Europe, within the United States, but also very much globally, very, very complicated, with different rules and guidelines emerging. How do you see alignment developing on AI between certain parties? How does a company like Google navigate this type of complicated environment? What are the roles, the responsibilities of the private sector? You mentioned your own internal code earlier. And do you think that, is there a path that you see towards some kind of multilateral or global governance?
Yeah, Fran, it is a complicated time. And, unfortunately, I would say the history of the last, number of years does not suggest that alignment is easily reached, particularly in the technology policy space. Frankly, even in the transatlantic area, let alone when you expand it out to the entire world. You've seen often coordination happening after action is taken or after sort of regulation gets pushed forward on both sides. By the way, I think the U.S. is as much guilty of this as other countries and institutions. And I think, on the other hand, I do think AI potentially offers an exciting possibility here, because regulation in this space is new, it's nascent. And when you are starting from effectively a whiteboard, as opposed to bodies of law and regulation that have evolved sometimes for years or decades, it can be easier to reach that common understanding. But look, the reality is, you've got 190 plus countries in the world. You've got AI in one form or another operating in all of them. And you are going to need a very proactive, very thoughtful approach by, I think, honestly, Europe and the United States acting together and acting jointly. So we would love to see that happen. I will say that even for Google, and we are a big company with a lot of resources to throw at compliance, the explosion in the number of regulations that we have seen happening, not AI specific, but just generally, privacy, content, you name it, around the world, is extraordinary. I was looking at the numbers just for APAC, for the Asia Pacific region, the last 3 years. More than 1,200 separate regulations adopted in that region applicable to online platforms. That's an average of 1 new regulation a day governing some aspect of the product. Now, I mean, I defy any industry to think about readjusting, changing its regulations, its products, on a daily basis to meet new. So what ends up happening, obviously, is some companies will not cross borders. They will not invest in localized products, and that can't be the right outcome here. The last thing I will just mention quickly is we're spending a lot of time rightfully talking about government approaches to sort of placing guardrails on the products. And again, we are fully supportive of that. But I also would flag, I think there are bodies of law and regulation and government activity that is going to focus on the bold side of the equation. In other words, countries are already, I was just traveling in the Asia Pacific region, I was in the Middle East. I can tell you there is a lot of interest in how to get to the front of the curve, the top of the curve of being at the forefront of the deployment of AI for industrial purposes, for agriculture, to be as competitive as possible. And that is going to require also some very thoughtful policy making around how do you create the right infrastructure, including human infrastructure, skills, and so forth. So I do think that there is we need coordination on multiple fronts to make sure that we don't end up in a race that's going to make it harder for, frankly, the companies that I think come from, a tradition, a set of values that we are going to want to see effectuated in the AI products, and we don't restrain that advancement while opening the door to other deployments that we're not gonna like as much.
So thank you for that. And I actually want to pick up on the way you ended there about companies that come from a heritage of, from democratic backgrounds, et cetera, and how we don't want to see necessarily a race to the bottom with companies that are less concerned about some of those values. And I'd like to turn to Elizabeth. The Biden administration has put out not only the things that we talked about before, but there have been some indications of a desire to think about how you do this in terms of multilateral governance. When Prime Minister Sunak was here recently, there was talk of the UK Summit for Safe AI. There have been some talk in the G7 about AI. How are you seeing that? What is when the US looks beyond the US-EU world, what do you see in terms of ensuring that companies that are rooted in a certain set of values and that we are pushing to maintain those values are not wiped aside by other companies that have fewer restraints?
Thanks, Fran. As you know, the U.S. is very actively involved in the ongoing activity at multilateral fora like the OECD, the UN, the Global Partnership for AI, the Council of Europe, international standards organizations, and the G7 Hiroshima AI process announced in May. And we welcome the Prime Minister's plans to host a global summit on AI safety in the UK and will be participating at a high level. I think the really important thing here is that the core values that underpin the United States and Europe's cooperation are shared by many countries around the world. It's part of why we saw such enthusiasm for the commitments enshrined in the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which now has many, many signatories in just a short period of time. And I think we're looking forward to working with the EU, with other like-minded nations, and with industry and civil society to develop really adaptable approaches to AI regulation that are grounded in a full understanding of AI's opportunities and risks. To go back to Karan's point, I think that we are excited about collaborating on R&D to help solve global challenges like climate, like health, like food insecurity. And that too is an important multilateral effort. And I think that we share with many countries a lot of the same areas of concerns around safety and security, including risks related to cybersecurity and potential threats to national security from intentional or unintentional use of these powerful tools. The focus on civil rights, equity, and privacy. The Vice President and President have met on numerous occasions with leaders in civil society to talk about the challenges and opportunities that AI brings, and how we can work to jointly address those challenges. Another category is democracy. We know that AI tools can be used for the purposes of spreading deep fakes, which can erode trust in democracy and public institutions. And we share with many countries a desire to combat that risk. The last point I'd make that has not come up, but I think is deeply important, is the potential impact of AI on jobs and the economy. While it has the potential to bring significant economic opportunities, growing the economy, increasing productivity, it could also cause labor force disruptions, including by automating certain jobs or being used in ways that restrict workers' autonomy. And I think we are excited to work with our allies and partners around the world to help address all of those risks and leverage opportunities.
So thank you for that. Kenton, let me come to you because I think we've heard from the others. A portrait of a future world in which AI is regulated or has guardrails, to use Karan's phrase, where there are certain things that are not done. And without getting into the specifics necessarily of those, it's a very different vision of the AI that you're describing, or the approach to AI that you're describing in China. And as we both reach out and try to bring others into our club, if I can put it that way, we can certainly see China reaching out and assisting countries that are part of its network on AI and technology development. And we can see the same from the US and the EU potentially. So what is likely to be China's reaction to an effort to build more multilateral governance, things like this, the UK summit on AI safety, and create a place where AI is used in a responsible way? Is that something that they will ignore because they can do what they want internally, or is it something that would be of concern?
Sure. I think I'll first speak to a little bit to how China kind of engages in this space a little more broadly. So China largely prefers to engage on these issues through the United Nations and through its multilateral engagements in forums like BRICS. So China's heavily engaged, for example, in standards organizations like the ISO and the ITU, for example, and often engages in block voting to get proposals that are preferable for its companies passed. These kind of ways that China engages is important because these discussions on AI, as you mentioned, go beyond China, the US, and the EU. The standards and regulations China develops will impact not only the deployment of technologies in China, but abroad as China exports its technologies, including those relating to content control, use cases on how to suppress online mobilization, et cetera, to countries, especially in the global South. So China does see itself as a leader of what's known as the G77 in the United Nations, and has championed itself as kind of the representative for developing countries. And in messaging in global South countries, China depicts European and American countries, largely as represented by the G7, as using measures of AI governance and cooperation on AI, including, for example, the US-UK Atlantic Declaration, as designed to sideline China and prevent it from participating in the formulation of technical standards on artificial intelligence. And they're also quite critical, and by they I mean official statements and in messaging to elites, of the idea of embedding democratic values in the introduction of AI standards and rules, saying that it's basically designed to widen the gap between North and South countries and aggravate the unequal distribution of power. And so China's called for itself really to lead in the UN and promote an alternative value to be baked into AI governance standards. And so, for example, China's promoting its own global data security initiative as China-led, as a China-led multilateral and bilateral mechanism to foster standards and agreement on security issues related to AI technologies. And one of these standards baked into the GDS is the idea that economic development is the basic human right. This idea is really meant to delegitimize the idea of universal and democratic values as the basis for defining human rights. So this is how China is engaging on the issue. And to Karan's earlier comment about countries around the world wanting these technologies to meet real development needs, this messaging as development as a primary right really resonates in many parts of the world. At the same time, when thinking about what values are baked into these regulations, Xinjiang was an R&D ground for Chinese AI. It's not a values neutral model, as we've discussed. It's based on data that was harvested in an exploitative and rights violating way. At the same time, however, China is one of the leaders in AI research, including on key questions relating to governance technologies and the role of human decision-making in shaping and controlling use of these technologies. And, as the examples of the global South show, its actions in the space are already shaping how AI is regulated, deployed, and developed, and will continue to do so. So on a kind of concluding note, in a transatlantic conversation where there are varying competitive and values interests, I think on the agenda should be, are there areas of AI where China and the rest of the world can collaborate and have conversations on? And in a conversation on AI and tech, are there ways democracies can do a better job of distinguishing where we should not be having conversations with China, for example, on the open internet? But questions on lethal autonomous weapons are where humans can have decision-making power over these things in a society, especially as these regulations and technologies are spreading an influence in other areas of the world, could be perhaps areas to engage.
So I want to build on that and go to Dragos to ask about the AI Act and the EU. If confronted with a very different ambition by China, the economic development model using AI for that, without regard for some of the other more authoritarian uses and whether those are engaged in. What can the EU do as the first, let's just say, the first regulator of AI in a formal sense? Is there anything you can do to combat that or to fight back against it? And do you see any areas, given what Kenton has said, do you see any areas where EU, US, China conversation might be useful on a specific element of AI?
Well, maybe I will start from that, because I think it's quite an important conversation to have. And I think pretty much everyone said that in this endeavor to do things together, we have to go past the US-EU framework. That certainly has to work as well as possible, as efficiently as possible, because it is important. But certainly, I think together, both US and EU have to understand that this conversation needs to get global. and truly global. Not only like-minded partners, like-minded democracies out there understanding values and technology in the same way, but certainly also bringing in the likes of China, and certainly that huge area in between of countries, let's call them the global south, but not necessarily only the global south, but those that are looking both at the democratic model, but also being tempted by some of the authoritarian perks that come from using Chinese built models and approaches. And why is it important? Because this technology, many are comparing this technology either with atomic energy or with whatever genetic engineering. It is that powerful. It is that important for our societies and our economies going forward in the next decades. And because it is that important, and because it is the same everywhere, both in China, in the global south, or over here, I think we simply cannot afford not to have and not to engage in a global conversation. Now, what is the right framework for it? Does it exist, or do we have to invent one? I think that's something that has to preoccupy the minds of our political leaders, and not only the political leaders. I think it is an important conversation to have also with the businesses. And I very much welcome any framework, whether it is going to be the UK summit in the autumn, whether it's going to be the G7 Hiroshima process with a code of conduct, whatever framework, but let's pick one, and let's start all of us investing in that framework. We can label it as we wish. But the important thing that is that, again, we create the space where we start discussing the potential, but also the risks of this technology for the years and decades to come as a global effort. Again, that does not mean, and now I come back to the first part of your question, that does not mean that all of a sudden we're going to have alignment with China. It's not going to happen. So we have to find that common denominator that brings even the likes of China in that conversation. But at the same time, then we have to look at what differentiates us, and also economically, because your question was economical. How do we look at the product services that are developed with the Chinese model, with databases that are China built and that might come and then compete on our markets? And there, first of all, we have to make sure that we screen all of these very well. And I think also using the TTC as a good framework, but I think we have also pretty much built in antidotes on both sides over the last couple of months and years. And I think we have to continue to invest in those antidotes. But also, I said earlier, the rules are going to be the same. The rules for staying in this market are going to be also the same for Chinese companies. And that's where rules are important, and standards will be important, because operating in an area without rules, that also opens up the possibility for Chinese companies and products and services to enter the market and play there, building on competitive advantages that they obtain in ways that are not congruent to our values. So I think it's a serious thought for why regulation is important.
So we have just a moment left, but I'd like to do a quick lightning round with all of you. And ask you, what is the next thing? Just one sentence, the next thing that needs to be done between the US, the EU, or in a more multilateral framework. How do we move from not being together to all being together? And let me start with you, Karan.
Sorry. Look, I think that dialogue is going to happen multilaterally. I think it is going to happen bilaterally. And I think it is going to happen, as MEP Tudorache just said, very much involving the private sector as well. Right. Bold, responsible, together, and I think let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's see, something is going to hopefully come out of it while we continue to innovate.
Great. Elizabeth.
I would agree. I think we need to build on our great US-EU cooperation for have much broader multilateral and bilateral conversations with a broader group of like-minded countries and other countries, as well as really bringing in the private sector and civil society to get this right.
Kenton.
Sure, I'd say maybe figuring out in our conversations, like where there should be more of a global conversation and where we should pretty much stick to maybe like-minded countries on these issues. And I think we've covered that pretty well.
Right. Dragos Tidrata, any last word?
Well, as a politician, I am looking with quite a lot of concern as the political turbulence is ahead of us. We have elections here in Europe. There are elections in the US. There are elections in Mexico. There are elections in many, many jurisdictions around the world, only in the next year alone. And I think what we have to do is try to think at anchors that we invest in, that will keep us on this course, irrespective of how these elections will turn up. And I think that's where the private sector has a crucially important role. That's where businesses have a role, because they have to remain the whisperers in our ears to keep us on a steady course, even if for political reasons we might want to derail at some point in time.
Well, thank you for that. I think that we have a full plate ahead of us in terms of thinking about AI and in terms of thinking about how AI works within Europe, between the United States and Europe, and with like-minded partners, and perhaps with China even. So I want to thank all of you for participating. I want to thank our audience and apologize to those for whom I could not get your questions, but thank you all so much for joining us today.